Bang! The starting pistol fires. Gauntz caused much consternation among his cast by firing a live revolver past Albert Dieudonné's ear to begin each shoot. That intensity is a microcosm of the Faustian dynamism that characterises Gauntz's epic. To take the shoot literally, in ironic fatalism, in triumphant mania, was Gauntz's attitude in the middle stages of the 20s. In 1919, Gauntz released J'accuse, a scathing and fatalistic critique of the First World War, a brother war, an absurdist war, a war of European capitulation. And so it is interesting that almost a decade later he would create its thematic counterpoise in Napoleon, perhaps even its resolution. It is a celebration of the heroism of militarism, shorn of the fetishism of war. Because militarism and warmongering are distinct, and it was the tradition of enlightened militarism, which Napoleon inherited from Frederick the Great, that Gauntz was celebrating. The sublimity of war before industrial death. After the artistic success of J'accuse and other works in the early 1920s, Gauntz won the freedom to create a biography of the greatest European, Napoleon. Originally, Gauntz had intended to create a 6-part biography spanning a Wagnerian 40 hours of film, but despite the fact the film was smothered in the crib in some ways, due to production problems, the Wall Street crash, and amazingly a somewhat tepid response to the actual film itself from the mass ranks of the bourgeoisie, only one part of Napoleon was actually released. And this is the film in question. It runs for about 6 hours, 6.5 hours, with intermissions, which grants it the status of an epic, despite its incompleteness. Now, Gauntz's influence in the European cinema was absolutely monumental. He inspired not only much of French New Wave cinema, but the greats of Nazi and Soviet cinema, and classic Hollywood directors like Stanley Kubrick. Now, Gauntz believed that the camera should be liberated, so that now the audience were no longer mere spectators. The film was no longer happening to them, but they were active participants in the drama. And this produces extraordinary scenes where he runs around with the camera, straps it to a horse and lets it gallop off, swings it from high wires, dives it into the sea to see, quote, what one wave looks like to another, and so on. And these visceral artistic attitudes, particularly in relation to the subject of Napoleon, was extremely innovative for its time, and has an artistic rhyming nature, in a way, to another great, ferocious artist, who probably also, if was shooting a film, would fire a live revolver past his lead actor's head in order to make him start up and have his eyes wide, and that is Thomas Carlyle. The harshness and biblical severity of Carlyle's prose, broken with extensive uses of the dash, creates a living text. When we read Carlyle's French Revolution, I had the privilege of actually reading it in, I think, a second edition from the University Reference Library back along. We're going back a little bit now. But you feel as though you're part of the revolution. You feel as though you're in the vortex. Gauntz and his cinematic representation of the French Revolution was in a way a transliteration of Carlyle's text into film. When Napoleon is escaping Corsica alone on a dinghy, using the revolutionary tricolour as a sail, and the scene cuts between the fiery, tormented seas and the purge of the Girondians, using the storm sequence from Beethoven's Sixth Symphony in the background. We're no longer spectators. The viewer is no longer some passive object that exists outside of the film, But Gantz almost reaches out of the screen and drags you in, forces you into this vortex and confronts you with the terror and the horror and the dynamism and even the transcendence, indeed, of that possibility. And the two eccentric artists, Carlyle and Gantz, grab us by our collar and hurl us into the tumult of that revolutionary vortex. And Gantz's quasi-demonic energy, frenetic cutting and intense close shots, was first explored in his earlier 1924 film LaRue. And this film prefigured much of the techniques that were adopted by Eisenstein in Battleship Potemkin. The scenes, particularly of the French Revolution in Napoleon, so influenced Eisenstein's October, released in 1928, 1 year following the release of Napoleon, that he, along with Podovkin, Alexandrov, and the rest of them, yes, they all travelled to Paris to personally thank Gantz for teaching them everything they knew. And his influence was enormous. You know, you can just imagine, Eisenstein, who's sort of beloved by the liberal and progressive left in cinema criticism, bending the knee to this film that many would consider to be quasi-fascistic. This film, speaking of quasi-fascism, in fact, let's go to naked fascism, inspired Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will in 1935. Now, Riefenstahl's obsession with movement, using tracks for the first time, introducing the concept of the dolly in a sort of crude form, but still the idea of liberating the camera and that the camera should be an object of movement and not some kind of static documentarian idea, was all owed to Gantz. They were all innovations of Gantz. Despite the insistence that this was from Eisenstein, remember Eisenstein, Alexandrov and Podovkin, etc., they all went to Gantz to say, thank you for creating LaRue, thank you for creating Jacques, thank you for creating Napoleon, because the influence was immense. The presence of Gantz in Triumph of the Will is plain to me in the famous shot in the opening of Hitler's plane advancing across the city. Now, that symbolism of German destiny, which was represented by the shadow of Hitler's plane, was a direct imitation, I think, or at least a reference to, the shadow of Napoleon's eagle, which led the French legions into Italy during the closing scenes of Gantz's film. And such a clear gesture to Gantz reveals at least the primacy or the degree of his influence on her. Now, given the film was created in 1927, there is a temptation to compare Napoleon to various political figures of his time. Some like to compare Napoleon to Stalin. They were both figures that consolidated their various revolutions, and in some ways perhaps Napoleon would have enjoyed that comparison. But this is not the Napoleon of the sceptre and the orb. This is not the Napoleon of those absolutely disgraceful portraits of him as emperor. This is the film that captures him as the young man, this is before he even crowned himself emperor. So Napoleon is considered in this film as a man of dynamism and movement, not as some kind of imperial consolidator. And this militaristic dynamism, I think, is far too much in the film for many doughy moderns. And of course, accusations of fascism are bandied about. There are rumours, as I mentioned earlier, it's based on certain historical figures, that Napoleon is perhaps based upon Mussolini and Italian fascism, but Gantz was not a fascist by any means. I think Napoleon succumbed to the same fate as Lang's Metropolis, which was released in the same year, incidentally, is that it was appropriated by the far right as a form of propaganda. And this, I think, is a symptom or consequence of a broader tendency in the right at that time to appropriate Nietzschean ideas and to distort them and, in a way, vulgarise them to a point. In fact, the National Socialists, have a bit of a digression, would later appropriate many other European works while not actually understanding their essences. The German musical laws of that controversial government at that time described Beethoven's music, Beethoven, as the apotheosis of German morality. Obviously, the Nazis were unaware that the Third and Fifth Symphonies of Beethoven were hagiographies and send-ups of the French Revolution. So, and even the Ninth was a testament to pantheism and esoteric transfiguration. It had very little to do with far-right or reactionary ideology. I mean, Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony with Plutarch's quote beside him that was engraved on the statue of Isis. I am all that has been and is and shall be. No mortal has ever lifted my veil. It was not a political testament like the Fifth or the Third, and it wasn't an ironic or scatological parody of ideology, as the normally insightful Zizek claims. Now, Zizek, as a figure, has certain strands of conservatism in him, and his attempts to defend Bach from the sort of vulgar conservatives is a great achievement, I think. That Bach was an absolute modern. He was an absolute reconstructionist in terms of trying to reform everything in this sort of a crucible of creative energy. And when we look to the, quote, degenerate artists of people in the Viennese school at the time of the Nazis, such as Schoenberg and Berg, I mean, remember, incidentally, that Berg actually supported the Anschluss, right? Even though he was himself a Jew. Schoenberg was always a kind of pessimist and always a kind of conservative. And what Schoenberg's project was about was trying to recreate the feeling of listening to Mozart and listening to Bach for the first time. And he understood that there was a very harsh streak of classicism and a very harsh streak of modernism. And all modernist and sort of not necessarily postmodernist, but contemporary modernist throwback compositions always have that strain of extreme severity. You can take someone like Harrison Birtwistle, for example, who's a contemporary English composer, and if you listen to the Masque of Orpheus, or you listen to his other compositions like the Minotaur that was released recently, you get that really harsh classical severity, that pagan that sort of that pagan absolutism, that sublime complexity and simplicity. So it's not the type of reactionary music that you would think of someone like Bach's descendants, who, as Zizek writes, were probably more reactionary than Bach, creating these sort of classical ditties for the bourgeoisie. Right, you have to remember in the 18th century you have this proliferation of opera, which was mainly to fulfill the desires of this new middle class. But Bach isn't interested for that, as Mozart said of Bach, that Bach writes for himself. But perhaps one might say he didn't write strictly for himself, but he wrote for God. So in terms of this tension between modernism, reactionism, and the sort of left appropriation and sort of détente with these type of modernistic far-right tendencies, Zizek is usually quite insightful. But he's totally wrong where he thinks that the Ninth Symphony and the march at the end is supposed to be some kind of scatological parody. It is a work of romantic spiritualism, of Goethean holism, revealing, as Goethe wrote, the open secret of the universe. And this comes to the dual aesthetic crimes of the National Socialists. And this is important because any film, from Birth of a Nation to Napoleon to Metropolis, is always tainted in some way by the actions of that government. And so if we are to look at the aesthetic crimes of that government, we can turn to something a little bit more mundane than the Holocaust. We can say that the destruction of the Vienna Philharmonic and the banning of sublime composers like Gustav Mahler were perhaps greater aesthetic crimes than that famous one. But the idea that white people or Europeans, white people more implicitly, will rise to a new Promethean greatness, and that idea is partly contained in Nietzsche, partly contained in Heidegger, partly contained in Gantz's Napoleon, is utterly abhorrent to certain peoples. And so Europeans are not given that conceptual space today with which to overstep the historical events that occurred in that government. And we all know who those people are. Now, the original score of the film, Napoleon, was written by Arthur Honegger, who was a member of the French musical collective Les Six. And Honegger had worked with Gantz before in previous films like La Rue. But the most famous member of Les Six was Francois Poulenc, who was a quixotic, neoclassical composer in the early 20th century, who then, upon the death of his friend, became a sort of Catholic and wrote a lot of very famous masses and organ works that are composed today. But there was this connection to Beethoven and connection to Napoleon, as Poulenc actually quoted the Eroica in the third movement of his trio for oboe, bassoon and piano. And if you listen to that piece, you have a transition from Haydn to Beethoven to this form of neoclassicism, and from Schoenberg and Berg that I mentioned earlier, on the sort of serialist or hypermodernist side, to the sort of neoclassicals like Stravinsky and Poulenc and Honegger. Honegger wasn't really a neoclassicist, but the point is that you're getting the same idea at that time, where you're getting this desire to return to something, but to return to it, and in the return you are revealing something pure and something that can be taken forward. It is, to quote Nietzsche, going back as one does before they take a great leap. Now, Honegger's score was replaced by Davis' score. I've not been able to find the original score online, but Davis' score is fantastic in itself. He employs Beethoven's Eroica, of course, the Coriolanus Overture, and a lot of Mozart and Haydn is thrown in. And he weaves this tapestry of quotations, but he puts his own theme soaring above it. This theme of destiny and the eagle of destiny, which is in a Straussian or Wagnerian mode, is a sort of leitmotif. And this doesn't just have context within the film, but also with what Gantz was trying to achieve in this epic, and what many epics of the time, including Griffith, were attempting to achieve, which was they were trying to grope towards the ideal of Wagner's total drama, where the visual, the musical, the metaphysical, and the dramatic are all combined together into this total work of total sensory overload. And that's not something that you can get today in films. You can have a vulgar kind of sensation in something like the Marvel Avengers films. But the type of sensory overload and the type of power that you get from films like Napoleon are features of the silent era, or D.W. Griffith's films are features of the silent era, and they've fallen down the memory hole somewhat, partly because they are quite problematic and people don't like to listen to silent films today. So his score's masterful. It captures the spirit of Napoleon as the archetype of Romanticism. You have to recall that Napoleon travelled with Goethe's literature and wrote many romantic treatises himself. He took Werther to Egypt. And on meeting Goethe, Napoleon revealed that he'd read The Sorrows of Paul Werther no less than 7 times, which, Werther, you could say, was the twilight of its time, perhaps. And Goethe, after seeing some of Napoleon's fiction, we don't know what he said, but I'm sure Goethe's lasting impression of Napoleon was of the quality of the man over the quality of his fiction. Because remember, Napoleon was a romantic artist whose subject was war and peace. And incidentally, when Napoleon became emperor, he decided to track down all of his essays that he submitted to the universities, all of his treaties on Corsican independence, etc., and he had them burned, all that could be found, because he said, quote, it would condemn him for all posterity. Now, some of these have survived. The most interesting of these is an autobiographical account, a sort of Dostoevskian idea. You have to think of something like Notes from the Underground. It's very short, where he recounts losing his virginity to a French prostitute, Parisian prostitute, and paying her then after to listen to him rant about Rousseau's philosophy and Corsican independence. So he was a bit of an edgelord even then, and you can understand why he tried to have all of his writings burnt when he became emperor. But despite him perhaps not being a fantastic writer, Napoleon was a military genius. In the opening scenes of Napoleon, Gaunt shows us the child Napoleon at the military academy of Brienne, engaged in a snowball fight. Now, this is apocryphal, but it has a structural primacy in the film and is a tool of foreshadowing of his genius. And it gives us the first indication of the genius montage, which is to be used again and again in the film. Not only is the footage here then recycled in the Battle of Toulon, but there's another component of this introduction which again condemns Napoleon to the dustbin of history, which is that the two antagonists that Napoleon has are alarmingly Semitic. Filippo and his comrade are two boys who are supposed to become the future antagonists of Napoleon in later films during the Coalition Wars, but these films were never made. And this is a feature of Napoleon that you have to accept when you watch the film, that many of the seeds, quite obvious seeds that Gaunt plants, are left to be ungerminated. But given the biographical nature of the film, it should be obvious for anybody who knows a little bit about history to reap that seed, even if it isn't allowed to germinate. Napoleon is bullied in school as a young boy for being Corsican. The Italians aren't white mean, was alive and kicking, I suppose. The boy's Napoleon his only consolation was his pet eagle, which was hidden away in an abandoned garret, provided for him by a very swarthy and French-looking butcher and cook who helps him out. And this eagle represents the intensity of his own vision. I mentioned the eagle earlier in relation to Riefenstahl, and this is when we first see it. Now, the two Semitic antagonists of the film release Napoleon's eagle into the wilderness, into the snowstorm. And when Napoleon discovers this, he explodes into an absolutely frenetic rage, interrogates his peers in the sleeping quarters, condemns their collective silence, and inflicts a collective punishment. His vengeful fury is unrelenting, and so he decides to attack all of the boys at once. Now again, your nose might be bleeding at this point because it is quite obvious, isn't it? It's a microcosm of his later military exploits against the arrogant European monarchies that would seek to deny him his destiny. Indeed, at this point, the world is denying him his eagle, the world is denying him his destiny, and so he must overcome the world. And Nietzsche's shadow looms over the scene. Obviously, being a boy, Napoleon is beaten by a schoolmaster and thrown out into the snow, and he lays on an old artillery cannon. Yes, again, I know your nose is broken, but you must enjoy in this film, because of its period in which it was created, its sort of iridescent symbolism and expressionist caricature. In fact, some of my favourite scenes in the film are expressionist caricatures. But this scene is mirrored when Napoleon sleeps on the drum at the battle during the siege of Toulon later in his life. But while Napoleon lies on this drum in the snow alone, that same very swarthy French, implicitly white cook comes and lays a greatcoat on top of him. Again, I know it's a bit over the top, isn't it? He cries in isolation and destitution, but his eagle returns to him on the cannon. Davis' strings sweep into a romantic climax, and the brass section shimmers with that theme of destiny. In that, He looks into the eagle, the passion explodes out of him, his tears of anguish and pain transfigure into tears of joy and of consolation and of intensity of his vision and of his destiny. That scene that opens the film as a sort of Nietzschean heraldic prelude is one of the few scenes in cinema that deeply stirs me into a sort of sublime trembling. It is similar to the finale of Tristan and Isolde, if you watch that opera. And it's perhaps one of my favourite films in silent cinema. Well, one of my favourite scenes, in silent cinema. So, what does this prelude of the film, this opening, end with? It ends with the eagle of implacable will, the star child Napoleon, and a Nietzschean fanfare. So from then, that opening, the film unfolds into such a multitude of vistas and creative ideas, so much innovativeness in his cinematography. There are some parts where the film drags, but it becomes such a great and complex work that for me to grasp the whole thing as some kind of synopsis would need me to create a video that's even longer than the film, which I'm not going to subject you to. So I skip to Gans moving us to the brooding revolutionary crowd. The Marseillaise is sung for the first time and is taught to the revolutionaries. Davis incorporated Gossac's first printed score in his interpretation of the hymn, and that then is infused, of course, into the rest of the film as a motif. And when Napoleon says, "I am the revolution," of course, Davis mirrors this by having the Marseillaise and the theme that he wrote, the Eagle of Destiny, connecting and interweaving with each other. And this is something that you only get in silent film. Roger Scruton wrote a fantastic book on Wagner called The Ring of Truth. And in that he proposes that Wagner has been corrupted in modern sort of, you think of Boulet's interpretations of The Ring, or more sort of modernist interpretations where, okay, the film the Ring cycle can be considered as being a Marxist piece of music, or Feuerbachian or atheistic, and it can be considered as being about class conflict. And there's actually a lot of literature around Wagner's own intentions that justifies that. But what Scruton identifies as modernism is not the class dynamics in The Ring, but the relationship between the drama and the music. Now, for Scruton, for Wagner to be performed correctly, there must be a parallelism and an equilibrium between the music and the drama, because the music represents the metaphysical component of the drama. And so to elevate the drama above the music is to elevate the physical above the metaphysical. And this is why watching silent films, and particularly watching Napoleon with Davis' fantastic score, is so transcendent and so different from anything perhaps that you've ever seen before. Because it contains two stories in one. It contains the drama on the screen and the fantastic, exceptional, innovative cinematography and direction of Gans. But you also have the metaphysical component, which is represented by the music. And the two weave together with such exceptional counterpoise that you could see it almost as sort of equivalent to a ballet. And this goes back to Poulenc, who wrote a lot of incidental music for ballets, as did Stravinsky, that at this time, in the 1920s, you have this idea of the music and the drama and the threnody of body and the movement as all being interconnected as a total work. And this is an experience when you watch this film that you will receive that you will not from watching The Avengers. Now, after this introduction of the revolutionary crowd, we cut to the three titans of the revolution themselves. Again, almost plucked out of Thomas Carlyle's multi-volume French Revolution. Robespierre with black glasses and a mafiosi scowl. the burly Danton stamping around Marat, who's a sort of willowy Bloomsbury set type character. And the shock to Robespierre is extraordinary on first viewing. It caused me to fall out into laughter, and the friend who I was watching it with. And I had the privilege as well to go and see it when the BFI re-released it. Because you find in this Gantz's expressionist caricature, this figure of the pock-scarred Robespierre with his black glasses. It's so fantastic, and you can see in that moment of the three revolutionary titans, this triumvirate of terror, the seeds that would be planted that would go on to inspire French New Wave cinema. It's almost as though I'm watching, Bresson or Godard or something. And Gantz captures that modernism that would go on to inspire the French New Wave cinema directors, but also it captures the modernism, bohemianism, and the harshness of the revolution. And French contemporary right-wing thinking also has a sort of bohemianism to it. It's quite similar in a way to what Gantz gives in Napoleon, which is something like the Nouvelle Droite, or the French New Right, the Grec Institute. Now, this is probably one of the most interesting rightist intellectual developments of the late 20th century. And it's not to be conflated, the European New Right, with the sort of Thatcherite New Right. But it's an attenuated sublimation of many of the ideas that were cardinal and essential to Europeans throughout history. There's, like in Gantz's film, a modernist severity and a classicism in the French New Right, just like Harrison Birtwistle's Minotaur or Mask of Orpheus. There's a combination between the modern and the ancient. I know that Kraut and Tea, for instance, is producing a video about how the ancient Greeks can't be considered as the foundation of Western civilization because they're so foreign. And indeed, there is an element of truth in that, where when you pierce the drama of Aeschylus or the drama of Sophocles, you find in that a real severity. And when you view the drama, not only the Greek drama performed as it was, classically, but when you have an opera that attempts to bring back that drama, like Mask of Orpheus, with modernistic music, you really feel transported into what is ultimately a pagan and what Bowden would probably consider to be an ultimately proto-fascistic ideal or mode. Now, Gantz, while not a reactionary and certainly not a fascist, although he flirted with what could be considered today as fascistic tendencies, did reveal glimmers of conservatism in the pauses for breath which punctuate his film. The figure of Josephine, for instance, in the film of Napoleon's lover, is represented as Napoleon's projection of his own majesty. And Gantz unspools that reactionary semiotic, probably for too long, but he uses techniques that have been lost or at least attenuated with the death of silent cinema. And Gantz's conservatism, or at least his reticence of progressive ideas, is revealed in some ways with Napoleon's reaction to the French Revolution as he experienced it. There's a very famous scene in Gantz's film where revolutionary mobs are marching outside of Napoleon's apartment, and the flames of the mob pierce the night as these tendrils of revolutionary terror creep up into his apartment. What is Napoleon's response? It isn't jubilation like the demonic Danton, who rips apart a horseshoe with his bare hands and says, "This is the establishment that we must break." No, Napoleon is a melancholic sort of figure. I mean, you can think of someone like in that famous film The Man Who Sleeps, right? He's a sort of classic existentialist figure living alone in his grotty apartment, reflecting on philosophical ideas. And Napoleon, when he sees this mob and these flames licking up to his apartment, he also sees them hanging a man from his balcony, and he looks between the taut rope, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and his pistol. After a series of rapid cuts, Gantz shows Napoleon breaking down in laughter, which gives way to a resigned melancholy. And this is what Napoleon saw, and this in so many ways sets up exactly what Napoleon's vision would be. Between the ideal and the mob is the gun. And it was, again, to bring back Carlyle, that quoted that famous quote, that famous phrase that Napoleon put down the revolutionary mob with a whiff of grape shot, right? And that is, in a way, Gantz is making a reference to that, is that Napoleon will control the mob to protect the revolution with the gun. But Napoleon was himself a man forged in the fires of Danton's revolution. But he was also its completion and, in some ways, a reactionary antithesis. Napoleon proclaimed, "I am the revolution." And there is a striking scene in Gantz's film where Napoleon is addressing the empty National Assembly chamber, and the ghosts of the revolution, the original, because of course, in every revolution has two stages. You have the first stage of united opposition and the second stage of just ferocious purging, all these different factions of ripping each other apart, because it's all about power in the end. So you have this... these figures beheaded, of course they've still got their heads, even though they lost their heads. They all come to Napoleon and they anoint him as a sort of pacifier. You could, again, comes back to the Wagnerian idea. They anoint Napoleon as the protector of the revolution. But this isn't played as a Napoleonic fantasy. This is portrayed as explicit and legitimate. It's one of those pauses for film, like in the Josephine section, that we're supposed to find very profound. Of course, this is very hit and miss in Gantz, and we remember him for his dynamism and not necessarily for his pauses for breath. So, while Napoleon isn't an explicitly political film, it is metapolitical. His sublime vision, the eagle of destiny, the heroic striving of Davis' score, the dynamism of Napoleon, the tragedy and the heroism of Napoleon, the united power of the French army marching across the Alps, the absolutely extraordinary finale where Gantz filmed three separate shots and combined them together in the editing room with this sort of finale of the tricolour. And Davis and the new BFI remaster actually brings back the tinted film that Gantz had to use in order to create this the French flag on this final shot of the film. And that's another thing that you have to consider when you watch this film, is the technical mastery, because Gantz did edit a lot of the film himself. And this was before digital technography and computers. This is where he would have to actually take the film himself, look through every single frame, and then cut and paste it together and add various effects, overlay certain film together to create these extraordinary blended effects. And he splits the screen into different components and brings different elements together, overlays thematic visions and symbols into the main drama. But all of this he had to do by hand. He didn't have some machine to help him. So it's a masterpiece not only of creative vision, but of technical expertise. And what is the ultimate conclusion of this film? In a way, a film that was saved by its failure, because we never got to see Napoleon fail. The essential characteristic of Gantz's Napoleon is dynamism, a restlessness of its people, of the French people, a restlessness of Napoleon, a restlessness of the camera, a restlessness of the music, a restlessness that was contained in Gantz's time and in our own. The static Napoleon as emperor, you get in a Bondarchuk or Ingres, is not found in this film. This is like, if you ever have the privilege of going to Vienna, you can go to the Belvedere, you can see the David painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps with his hair flying and the horse's mane going. That's the image of Napoleon that we have in this film. Gantz's vision of Napoleon is that of David's Napoleon crossing the Alps. It is the heroic subject of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Nietzschean subject of the young, gaunt, dynamic man with a will to power, eyes full and wide of intensity. Bowden said, "We've lost our dynamism as a people, and if things are to change in this century, we must recover it." Upon the destruction of the French fleet during the siege of Toulon in the film, the British Navy manoeuvre around Napoleon's rear, encircling him. Through the furies of cannon and blood, Napoleon commanded his men to turn about the guns to face the British, where a common soldier cried out, "We cannot! It is impossible!" To which Napoleon answered, "Impossible is not French." So I urge all Europeans today, and all of European stock, to seek out this film, Napoleon, if only to shake off some of your own imagined impossibilities. So I give you Napoleon and Abel Gance.